August 4th, 2026. Right now, one of the most powerful storms the Pacific has produced this year is tearing past a remote Japanese island chain, and it's still 4 days away from where forecasters say it could matter most. Typhoon Dolphin, a storm that exploded from a tropical depression into a Category 5 equivalent monster faster than almost any system in the Western Pacific since 2022, is currently battering the Ogasawara Islands with violent winds and waves exceeding 10 meters, more than 30 feet high. 6 major Japanese airlines have already canceled flights, and forecasters are now tracking a path that puts Dolphin approaching Okinawa's main island by August 7th, a stretch of Japan, home to more than 1 million people, still carrying dangerous near-typhoon intensity. So today we're breaking down exactly where Dolphin stands right now, how it managed to strengthen this fast, why storm surge specifically is the hazard meteorologists are most worried about as this track develops, and what residents across the Ogasawara, Daito, and Ryukyu island chains need to know over the next several days. Before we get into it, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap that bell icon so you get notified the moment this track updates. Because a storm that's already proven it can intensify this fast is exactly the kind of system where the forecast could shift meaningfully in either direction before it reaches Okinawa. Drop a comment right now. If you're anywhere in Japan right now, especially in Okinawa, the Ryukyus, or the Ogasawara Islands, tell me what preparations you're seeing on the ground, or if you've got travel plans in the region this week. I want to hear directly from people tracking this in real time. Now let's get into exactly where Dolphin stands. Let's start with the numbers, because this storm's rise has genuinely been remarkable by any meteorological standard. Dolphin strengthened so quickly after forming that analysts described it as the fastest growing tropical storm in the entire Western Pacific Basin since Typhoon Noru back in 2022, moving from tropical storm strength all the way to Category 4 equivalent intensity within a matter of days. It kept climbing from there, eventually reaching Category 5 equivalent strength and becoming the 4th super typhoon to develop over the Northwest Pacific so far in 2026, following Sinlaku, Bavi, and Makala earlier in the season. On a global scale, Dolphin became the planet's 5th Category 5 tropical cyclone of the entire year, a count that already has 2026 running ahead of the pace set by 1997, the all-time record year for Category 5 storms worldwide, which ultimately produced 12. That single data point tells you something important about the broader pattern behind this individual storm, because Dolphin isn't an isolated freak event. It's the latest entry in a year that's already producing an unusually high number of the most extreme tropical cyclones the planet can generate. As of the most recent Japan Meteorological Agency update, issued at 9 in the morning local time on August 3rd, Dolphin, officially designated Typhoon number 13 by Japanese authorities, was located over the waters near Minami Torishima Island, moving west-northwest at 10 knots, with a central pressure of 945 hectopascals and maximum sustained winds near 85 knots, roughly 100 miles an hour, with gusts reaching 120 knots. By the following day's update, 6 in the morning on August 4th, the storm had moved further west, passing south of Chichijima Island in the Ogasawara chain, still classified by Japanese meteorologists as a large and very strong typhoon, carrying maximum sustained winds of 45 meters per second, close to 100 miles an hour, with gusts up to 60 meters per second, roughly 134 miles an hour, and central pressure holding at 945 hectopascals. Satellite imagery captured during this stretch showed a clearly defined eye surrounded by the tight, circular cloud pattern characteristic of a genuinely powerful, well-organized typhoon, with thick, high clouds concentrated most heavily near the storm's center and along its eastern flank. The Ogasawara Islands, a remote, sparsely populated Japanese island chain sitting roughly 620 miles south of Tokyo, are absorbing the brunt of Dolphin's most violent conditions right now, in real time, as this video comes together. Japanese meteorological officials forecast violent winds, heavy rain, and waves exceeding 10 meters sweeping across the island specifically on August 4th, with dangerous weather likely continuing into August 5th as the storm's broad circulation continues moving through the region. Even though the storm's actual center is forecast to pass south of the main inhabited islands in the chain, meaning a direct dead center hit isn't expected there, Dolphin's circulation is simply large enough that severe conditions are affecting the broader island chain, regardless of the storm's precise center track. Local officials have been urging residents and any visitors currently in the Ogasawara Islands to stay away from beaches and ports entirely and remain in safe locations, specifically warning that both winds and waves could intensify rapidly with very little additional warning as the storm's closest approach unfolds. From the Ogasawara Islands, the forecast track has Dolphin continuing westward, expected to approach the Daito Islands as a strong storm on August 6th, passing to the north of that island chain while still bringing increasingly powerful winds and heavy rain to the area. By August 7th, current forecasts have Dolphin reaching the vicinity of Okinawa's main island, still retaining significant near-typhoon-strength winds at that point in its track. That timeline matters enormously because Okinawa's main island alone is home to well over 1 million people, and the broader Ryukyu island chain, including Amami Oshima, and the surrounding region specifically named in the Japan Meteorological Agency's forecast, adds significantly more to that total population figure. Weather News, one of the region's most closely followed private forecasting services, specifically noted in its August 3rd bulletin that Dolphin is expected to maintain its very strong intensity through roughly August 6th, continuing its generally westward track, passing south of Chichijima on August 4th exactly as observed, and forecast to approach the waters near Amami Oshima and Okinawa around August 7th, language that lines up closely with the Japan Meteorological Agency's own official track. It's genuinely useful to understand how this storm's forecast has actually evolved over just the past several days, because it illustrates exactly the kind of uncertainty meteorologists were flagging even as Dolphin first began strengthening. Earlier forecasts, issued when the storm was still developing well east of Japan, described its longer-range path as genuinely uncertain, with meteorologists at the time saying it was too early to say definitively whether Dolphin would approach the Japanese mainland directly, bend south toward Okinawa specifically, or track somewhere else in the basin entirely. Some of that early modeling even suggested a track continuing further west toward the East China Sea and potentially affecting southeastern China, Hong Kong, and South Korea through the storm's broader outer circulation, contributing to very hot, dry conditions along those coastlines, separate from any direct wind and rain impact. As the storm has continued developing, and forecasters have gathered several more days of consistent track data, that uncertainty has narrowed considerably, with the current, most confident guidance now converging specifically on an approach toward the Amami and Okinawa region by August 7th, rather than the wider range of possible outcomes being discussed just days earlier. Given how quickly this storm intensified in the first place, going from tropical storm strength to Category 4 equivalent within days, faster than any Western Pacific system since 2022, it's worth understanding exactly why storms are capable of that kind of explosive growth, and why forecasters treat rapid intensification as one of the single most important factors when assessing how dangerous an approaching typhoon might ultimately become. A tropical cyclone's fuel is warm ocean water, and specifically, how much of that warmth extends down below the immediate surface layer, rather than sitting in a thin, easily disrupted band right at the top of the ocean. When a storm passes over water that's warm not just at the surface, but for hundreds of feet beneath it, there's no reservoir of cooler water close enough to the surface for the storm's own churning action to pull up and interrupt its fuel supply, meaning the storm can draw on nearly unlimited energy and intensify with very little to check that growth. Combine that kind of deep, sustained ocean warmth with low wind shear, meaning consistent wind speed and direction at different altitudes rather than a disruptive difference between them, and you get almost ideal conditions for a storm to organize a tight, well-defined eye and rapidly climb through intensity categories. Exactly the pattern captured in the clearly defined eye visible in satellite imagery of Dolphin as it passed the Ogasawara Islands this week. It's also worth understanding a detail specific to this storm's current structure that matters directly for anyone trying to assess their own risk level as Dolphin's track continues toward Okinawa. Meteorologists have specifically emphasized that Dolphin is large, with an unusually broad wind field extending well beyond its immediate center, which is exactly why the Ogasawara Islands are experiencing severe conditions right now, even though the storm's actual center is forecast to pass to the south of the main inhabited islands, rather than directly over them. A storm with a broad wind field like this one doesn't need to make a precise, direct hit on a specific location to cause serious impacts there, since typhoon-force winds, dangerous seas, and heavy rain can extend outward for a significant distance from the center in every direction. That's exactly the dynamic worth watching closely as Dolphin approaches the Daito Islands and then Okinawa over the following days. Because even if the storm's exact center ultimately tracks somewhat north or south of Okinawa's main island itself, the storm's broad circulation could still bring genuinely dangerous conditions to the region, regardless of whether the center makes a textbook direct landfall. Now let's talk specifically about storm surge, because that's the hazard flag directly in this story's headline, and it deserves a proper explanation of the actual mechanism rather than just being mentioned in passing. Storm surge is the abnormal, wind-driven rise of ocean water pushed ashore ahead of and during a tropical cyclone's approach, distinct from the normal tide cycle and capable of flooding low-lying coastal areas with startling speed once a storm draws close enough. It's driven primarily by a combination of a storm's sustained wind speed pushing water directly toward the coast, the storm's overall size, and how large an area of ocean its wind field is affecting simultaneously, its forward speed as it approaches, and the specific shape and depth of the coastline and seafloor it's approaching, which is exactly why a storm's category or maximum wind speed alone doesn't perfectly predict how severe its storm surge will actually be. Okinawa's main island, along with much of the broader Ryukyu chain, includes low-lying coastal areas and dense coastal development that are specifically vulnerable to this kind of surge. Precisely the reason meteorologists and local officials pay such close attention to a storm's track and size as it draws near, not just its peak wind speed reported from open ocean days before landfall. Given Dolphin's unusually broad wind field, currently on full display in the extended impacts being felt across the Ogasawara Islands, despite the storm's center passing to their south, the storm surge risk for Okinawa as Dolphin's approach continues into the weekend is a genuine, serious concern that local and national disaster management officials will be monitoring closely as the track firms up over the coming days. The disruption from this storm has already extended well beyond the remote islands currently bearing the brunt of its winds and waves. 6 major Japanese airlines, including All Nippon Airways and Japan Airlines, have already announced flight cancellations tied directly to Dolphin's approach and its expected impact on the Ogasawara and broader southern island region, a decision made well ahead of the storm's most dangerous conditions arriving at any specific airport, consistent with the pattern Japanese transportation operators typically follow of suspending service preemptively, rather than waiting until conditions actually become hazardous on the ground. That kind of advance cancellation is worth understanding clearly if you have any travel plans touching this region over the coming week, because it means disruption to flights, ferries, and other transportation can begin well before the storm itself has arrived anywhere near a specific location. Exactly the pattern that's already played out with this week's airline cancellations, tied to a storm whose center, as of this recording, remains passing south of the Ogasawara Islands rather than anywhere near Okinawa itself. There's also a broader seasonal context worth understanding here, because Dolphin isn't developing in isolation from the rest of this year's climate pattern. According to data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the current El Niño pattern developing across the tropical Pacific is intensifying rapidly, with an 81% likelihood of reaching very strong or even super El Niño status during the October through December stretch later this year. As covered in earlier coverage of this year's broader typhoon season, El Niño reshapes atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire Pacific basin, and in the Western Pacific specifically, tends to reduce the kind of disruptive wind shear that would otherwise limit how strong individual storms can become, one of the underlying reasons behind both this year's unusually active start to typhoon season and the specific conditions that allowed Dolphin to intensify as explosively as it did. With 2026 already producing its 4th super typhoon and its 5th global Category 5 storm, running ahead of even the historic 1997 season's pace, and with El Niño's intensifying influence expected to continue building deeper into the back half of the year, meteorologists tracking this basin have made clear that Dolphin is very unlikely to be the last storm of this caliber Japan has to track closely before the season concludes in October. Given everything covered so far, here's the honest, complete picture of where Dolphin actually stands as of this recording. This is a storm that intensified explosively, reached Category 5 equivalent strength, and is currently battering the Ogasawara Islands with violent winds and waves exceeding 10 meters, even as its exact center passes south of the main inhabited islands there. From this point, the most confident piece of the forecast has Dolphin continuing westward, approaching the Daito Islands by August 6th, while maintaining strength as what Japanese meteorologists are describing as a strong storm, before reaching the vicinity of Okinawa's main island by August 7th, still retaining significant sustained wind speeds at that point. The storm's unusually broad wind field means that even a track that ultimately passes somewhat north or south of Okinawa's exact coastline could still bring genuinely dangerous wind, rain, and storm surge conditions to the region. Precisely why officials and forecasters are treating this approach with such seriousness this far in advance, rather than waiting until the storm is directly on top of the island chain to begin issuing warnings and travel advisories. So here's what's actually worth doing with this information if you're anywhere in the path Dolphin is currently tracking toward, whether that's the Ogasawara Islands right now, the Daito Islands over the next 2 days, or Okinawa and the broader Ryukyu chain by the end of this week. If you're currently in the Ogasawara Islands, follow the safety guidance already being issued by local officials directly, staying away from beaches and ports entirely, and remaining in secure, safe locations through at least August 5th, given how rapidly officials have specifically warned that both wind and wave conditions could still intensify further with limited additional warning. If you're anywhere along the storm's forecast track toward Okinawa over the coming days, track this storm through the Japan Meteorological Agency's official English-language typhoon bulletins, along with secondary live tracking resources like Zoom Earth or windy.com, which update the storm's position and projected path in close to real time, rather than relying on a single forecast snapshot that could shift meaningfully as the storm continues developing. If you have upcoming travel to Okinawa, the broader Ryukyu Islands, or connecting flights through airports in the region over the coming week, check directly with your specific airline for updated cancellation and rebooking policies now, given that 6 major carriers have already begun canceling flights tied to this storm well before its closest approach to the most populated parts of the region, and build genuine flexibility into any travel plans, rather than assuming the storm's current forecast track will hold precisely as currently projected. If you're a resident of Okinawa or the broader region currently in Dolphin's forecast path, this is exactly the window to review your own emergency preparedness, securing outdoor furniture and objects that could become dangerous projectiles in high wind, identifying your evacuation route if you live in a low-lying coastal area at risk from storm surge specifically, and stocking basic emergency supplies including water, flashlights, and a way to keep your phone charged if power service is disrupted, rather than waiting until an official typhoon warning is actually issued for your specific area. And regardless of exactly where Dolphin's center ultimately tracks relative to Okinawa's coastline, treat the storm's broad wind field as a genuine reason to take any official warnings for the broader region seriously, even if your specific location doesn't end up sitting directly in the storm's most intense inner core. Stepping back from the day-to-day track updates, here's the piece of this story worth carrying with you as Dolphin continues its approach over the coming days. This storm represents one of the more genuinely remarkable individual tropical cyclones of an already unusually active 2026 season, intensifying faster than any Western Pacific storm since 2022, reaching Category 5 equivalent strength, and becoming the 4th super typhoon and 5th global Category 5 of the year, in a season already outpacing the historic record year of 1997. It's currently delivering violent winds and waves exceeding 30 feet to the remote Ogasawara Islands, and forecasters are now converging on a track that brings significant, near-typhoon strength conditions toward the Daito Islands, and ultimately, the heavily populated Okinawa region by the end of this week. The storm surge risk specifically, driven by Dolphin's unusually broad wind field rather than simply its peak recorded wind speed, is exactly the kind of hazard that deserves close attention from anyone in the storm's broader path over the coming days. Regardless of whether the exact center ultimately makes a precise, direct approach to any single specific coastline. We'll be tracking Dolphin's track and intensity closely as it continues developing over the coming days, whether it maintains its current strength as forecast through its approach to the Daito Islands in Okinawa, and exactly how close and how strong the storm ultimately is by the time it reaches the most populated parts of the region on August 7th. Subscribe and hit that bell icon right now so you don't miss those updates, because a storm that's already proven capable of intensifying this fast is exactly the kind of system where the forecast could shift in either direction before it reaches the islands home to over 1 million people. And drop that comment below if you haven't yet, wherever you're watching from, whether you're tracking this directly from Japan or simply following along as this storm continues its approach. See you in the next one.